Hello, I'm Susie. Welcome to my podcast. It's been a minute since I have had room in my squishy brain for this silly little podcast of mine. I've been thinking about it quite a lot. In fact, I have an entire episode, kind of researched and sketched out, my brain just couldn't make itself get there to like the recording piece. So that was sort of a signal to me that I should maybe put pause on that because I wasn't able to focus on it. It's on media and journalism and news, um, something that affects our lives. Like, oh my God, like I can't really think of, another thing that really like seeps into our lives in such a way as journalism and news, and then sort of like the media sphere. So I want to talk about that a lot. I have a billion thoughts about it, but they're really not organized. And if you listened to the last series that I did on speech, I think you'll agree with me that it's better when I have crystallized my thoughts into something structured. Otherwise, I'm just really, yammering at you in an in a messy, albeit perhaps fun to listen to, I hope, way, but messy nevertheless. And what's the takeaway from that other than, wow, that bitch is messy? So, that's not really the look I'm going for. I mean, I can't really avoid it. It's part of my brand, I guess, but it's not like the first thing I want people to think about is like, woof, she's messy. So, with that, I have put together a little just kind of general what-upness kind of conversation that I'd like to have. It's funny that I frame it as a conversation. It's really a conversation with myself. Some thoughts, I guess. Less a conversation than a monologue, I suppose. Which, and let's not, sneeze at the value of a monologue. There's something to be said for that. It's not as much fun as a dialogue, in my opinion, either for the listener or for the speaker, but be that as it may. In the upcoming parts of this episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's going on. I have had a lot going on in my life, which has kept me from really being able to focus on this, as I mentioned, and n- not dissimilarly, the world has had a lot of stuff going on. So I know everyone listening to this within the sound of my voice is in the same boat, whether you're in the US or in the world. The world is a really weird place. And I'm not even going to qualify that to say like it's a really weird place right now because it's always been really weird. But we have these really interesting brains that allow us to, forge little illusions and stories that allow us to get by. It's a really healthy mechanism, but it's a double-edged sword, our weird brains in our weird world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the midterm elections coming up because that's been on my mind a lot. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and kind of a few sort of sub areas within the Supreme Court, including current cases that are before the Supreme Court on the shadow docket now, and the impact that they have the potential to wreak on society. And then also just some general thoughts about the court as an institution. So that's stuff I want to talk about that I think is very relevant right now as we in the United States approach our midterm elections, which nobody generally gives a shit about midterm elections, but I do right now, and I think a lot of people do right now. And I think if you're kind of wondering why this set of midterms seems to be garnering so much buzz, let's talk about that and figure out why you should maybe want to, get in there. So, yeah, that's coming up. Stick around with me, please. No, no, that was terrible. Don't do that. That is what is coming up. I hope you'll hang out. So, the 2022 midterm elections are getting ready to happen in the United States. They're coming up in about 3 weeks as I record this, a little less than. There's a lot on the ballot right now, and the common thread amongst human beings is we have very short and selective memories, and we have no apparent issue with contradictions, which makes polling difficult. It makes understanding like what's going to happen difficult because people are not easy to predict. Ta-da! But there are a couple of really important issues that sort of sit within that context as we come up to the elections, and I think that they're important to focus on because they are couched amidst a lot of noise that can push people off focus. So, in general, vis-a-vis elections, vis-a-vis democracy, small d, the constancy of the struggle for equitable self-governance is just within us. It's we will always have that struggle, that we will always have that push and pull. The tension will always exist because of how we think of power. And how we think of power is very relevant to our how power has manifested itself in our individual lives. And that's one reason why the acknowledgement of privilege is really, really important because it's a way to have a broader understanding of power and how it affects people's lives, kind of in general versus just, you and like your stuff, right? So, that is particularly poignant right now coming up into this election for a lot of reasons. Right now, the majority of Republican candidates are 2020 election deniers, and that's troubling. That's seriously troubling. First, because there's just no data to suggest that that happened, right? And yet here we are still talking about it. The narrative lives on. It's very much like the Southern like lost cause narrative after the Civil War is, like we lost, but we didn't really lose. We our cause didn't lose. But in this case, they're very much like we in actuality didn't lose. Like there was shenanigans with the elections, and there was very much not. There was just not. In fact, there were a couple independent studies that indicated that it was actually the most voted in and the most secure election of all time, like in the whole history of the United States, which I find an interesting point that no one is really like pointing to that anywhere ever, like on the media. They keep kind of going like, they're election deniers. And saying like, the evidence isn't there. Okay, but what about the evidence that is there? And the evidence that is there was that it was the most voted in and the most secure election in the history of the United States. Like that is not a small thing. So I think it's important to keep that in your brain pan context of like, oh my God, there's so much noise. Like people are still talking about this. It must still be a thing. No, it is not a thing. It was never a thing. And the reason why it's deeply problematic and why the liberals in your lives are like, the democracy is dying, the world is falling. Like the reason why people are flipping out is because we were very close to losing it on January the 6th, 2021. And these people who are now in offices and have very much the potential to control elections at the state levels as well represent an agenda that we've seen tends towards autocracy, and that's not great for anybody, right? Like it might be great for like a bunch of white people in a particular like subsection of society like right now, but I guarantee you it won't last. Like they're coming for you too. So I just it's a very short-sighted and very sort of selfish way of thinking in my estimation that doesn't really take the history into account, which is kind of important. And you know the January 6th hearings that occurred over the summer, and then they did the ninth and last hearing recently, in which they voted to subpoena the former president. And they, in that last hearing, presented like very clear and sort of undisputable evidence that the president knew that he had lost, and he had a plan to obfuscate and lie and manipulate the outcome in multiple ways. It wasn't just like one strategy. He was like attacking it from multiple sides, and there's lots of evidence that proves that. So that's like, whoops, that's a problem. And I think that the important thing to keep in mind with that, and like why are liberals still like, hand wringing over January the 6th, is because this guy is going to run again. He's under like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different criminal investigations right now, some federal, some state. He's going to run again. And there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits a convicted felon of running for office, just FYI. I think that that's a common understanding that people have, that if you've been convicted of a crime, like you can't vote, so therefore you can't run for office. Like in a lot of states, you can't vote. There's only been recent changes on that. So there's a presumption, right, that one leads to the other, but that's not true. That's not true. Like you could technically be sitting in jail, and run. You could. That there's nothing legally to prevent you from doing that. It's social constraints that stop us from doing things like that and from making people be like, I don't want to vote for a guy who's in jail, you know? So that's an important thing to remember, is that we do follow social norms. I think I've talked about this a lot, that, a social understanding of cultural shape and power and, resource allocation is sort of understood among us. It's not documented in any law or any code, in a lot of instances. They're just political and institutional norms that we sort of just think are, well, we don't have to document that. Everybody knows. The debt ceiling used to be like that. The debt ceiling was one of those things that was like nobody understood or gave a shit about the debt ceiling because it was kind of a made up statistic that was an indicator of economically, like where we were internationally in terms of borrowing and crediting, right? So the debt ceiling is not like it's not like a foreclosure. Like there's no bank that's coming. Like the Iron Bank is not coming for the US government to be like, you owe us this money, give it to us or we'll destroy you. Like that's not what's happening. But yet it was turned into a political mechanism that created, government shutdown scenarios. People were out of work for a while. Like it's that kind of thing, right? It's a political tool that's used to manipulate people's actual lives so that they can blame it on somebody. And then those people will be like, yeah, get those guys out of office. It's very cynical and very disrespectful to the people that it hurts. And again, one of the things that I think is important to remember in this context is that, like, thematically as a country, we have since the very beginning had fundamental and sometimes violent disagreements over the nature of our own governance. And I think it speaks to basic human instincts that shape our perspectives on power, as I said before. Who should have it? Over whom should it be wielded? Are there degrees, or is everyone equal under the same system? In my estimations, humans have a masterful ability towards hypocrisy. We can pretty regularly hold two conflicting ideas in our minds at once without difficulty. And that quality can and regularly is leveraged to manipulate and or consolidate power. Similarly, we thrive on denial and selective memory, so we love to forget dark chapters in our history because they're icky. They don't make us feel good, you know. But that denial then becomes an alternate narrative in which fact becomes legend and legend becomes myth and myth becomes deniable. And that's not cool. It's not okay for our democracy to allow oppression because that's, quote, the way it's always been, because it hasn't, like in certain contexts, like there have been moments of, genuine equity. They've been brief and fleeting. But, if you study about Reconstruction, you'll see that there were a lot of energy towards, genuine equity. And we had like a brief, beautiful, like clean, deep breath. And then it all, fell to shit. But it's what we do as a people, not just Americans, but Americans are really good at it. We based our whole system on the First Amendment. It's the very first article in the Bill of Rights, and the importance of that communication, right? That need to express our political will vocally to our representatives because they are elected to represent us, right? Like that's like in our DNA. And I would argue that that DNA extends to cultural communications as well, right? Like we are a loud and obnoxious and, confrontative and combative and, very sort of aggressive people. And, we are very self-entitled and self-righteous in our way. Like, Americans are really obnoxious in a lot of ways. And, and hypocrisy is not a stranger to us. We've done it ever since the beginning. I mean, if you look at the Constitution itself and the fact that it doesn't address slavery in any way, shape, or form, but it does manage to still support the idea of the lessening of a human person by identifying it as three-fifths of an actual human person, right? So there you have the ideological sort of cosign of you know, the dehumanizing of an entire section of people in our founding documents, right? But at the same time, they're like, equal justice under the law and the inalienable rights that we have endowed by our creator, So again, whoa, hypocrisy. And we found our way through that. And we'll find our way through this. I believe it, because I think most people kind of, understand it and want that in their core, but they are prone to make their decisions based on their own experiences of the world. And if their experiences of the world tell them that, all of this, liberal hand wringing about the end of democracy is in fact a, false flag for what is in fact the actual ending of democracy and the liberal agenda taking over. And, they want to come for your kids and, feed them to Satan. I don't know what the deal is with the Republican Party anymore. This is not the platform of values that the conversations used to be happening around. It was always about fiscal policy and defense spending. And I mean, and after 9/11, it became a little more about, civil liberties. But I mean, where are you, Republican Party? Like, what's happening to them? I don't understand it. And it's genuinely terrifying because it very much looks like the Nazi Party in the mid-30s. What the fuck? Like, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, they're just like the Nazis. Like, I hate that shit. But in this case, it's like a factually legitimate parallel, which is, it, can you think of the adjective? Because I can't. Like, there's no, every adjective I think of sounds like histrionics, sounds like some kind of like radical hyperbole. But in fact, it's, real bad. This is very bad. We are more divided than we've ever been as a country since the Civil War. That's bad. Bad. And that kind of takes me back to that whole media journalism conversation that I want to have and why it's so difficult and complicated, right? Because there's so many layers there. Like, woof. Ugh. Democracy is rough. It's hard. It's messy. It's difficult to maintain. We all know this, and yet we all keep pointing at the other guys and being like, you're trying to break it. But no, everybody's trying to fight for their own interests. And that includes power. And that includes Democrats too. Like, let's not for just a moment think that people in the Democratic Party are, absent the ambition to power. That's ludicrous. I would say that by and large, the Democratic Party and its members tend more towards trying to hold on to the core principles that they're fighting for, which is why they can't really get along internally because everybody's sort of fighting for their own shit and trying to be the most noble guy, I guess. Or, consolidating power, as the case may be. They're in the party. This is not a us against them, kind of thing. Politics in general and the quest for power and the quest to hold power is not something that's exclusive to one party. It's a human endeavor. So let's just, agree to agree on that, at least. Abortion. It's just been through my whole life a hand grenade of political difficulty that no one wants to talk about. I have realized myself that I've tiptoed around this issue my life long, in terms of talking about it, in terms of even saying the word abortion. There's, I think, such a stigma that has been attached to it, which is why it's such a difficult thing, to talk about. Women who have had abortions feel deep shame even though they believe in their choice, right? It's not an easy choice to make for anyone. And I don't think that historically Democrats or pro choice activists have done the best job that they could have done. And I feel shitty saying that because, girl, they worked. I mean, they worked. They fought for this thing, man. They fought to keep it. They knew it was tenuous and they fought to keep it. And I thank them. I thank every single person who put themselves on the line to fight for a woman's right to bodily autonomy, like every other human fucking person in this country, e.g., the men. Why would our rights be any different from the men? That's stupid. It's just stupid on its face. That's what I think. So I'm not gonna, bandy about that one. I'm just gonna tell it like it is on that. So here's what I want to say about Roe, and the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision. It was sick. It was gross. It was stupid. It was genuinely stupid. The argument itself was fucking stupid. I mean, a reference to a 17th century, pseudo science scholar, referencing witches. Give me a break, man. Like, how are we using that as a basis for 21st century law? Are you shitting me? That's like one of the most offensive things I've ever heard in my life. Seriously, fuck you, Justice Alito. Fuck you. Coming and going, sideways and diagonal. You're just a bitch. Yeah, I said it. I'm mad. I'm still mad about it. It's fresh for me. I don't like it. And it is on the ballot for me coming up. You better believe it is. And I'm in a very, 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 very blue state, but there's some weird stuff going on our ballot too, right? E.g., the 2020 election deniers. And, things aren't as secure here as they have historically been. So you better believe I'm going to be voting. Okay. But to more calmly state, my thoughts here with regard to Roe and the overturning of Roe. That shit is not over by a mile. No way. And the current president, Joseph Robinette Biden, poor bastard, he made a recent announcement indicating that, if the Democrats are successful in winning control in Congress, then they will absolutely move forward with codifying access to abortion federally. And I say, huzzah. I say, good. It's about time. It should have been done a long, 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 long time ago. Like, I get it. Why it was like a political football. Again, see the grenade comment before, like nobody wanted to dick with it. And while Roe was intact, there was no need to dick with it. But here we go. Right. This is where it's come to, and this is what we got to do. So that's in my vote, and I hope it will be in many other people's votes as well. Because, here's one of the things that, again, I don't think that those activists, pro-choice activists, Democrats who have fought to protect Roe, one of the things that they didn't succeed at is helping people understand the actual impact to their lives, right? Like, abortion was always talked about as a moral issue, but it's not a moral issue. It's a medical issue. And that's the problem that no one's really talking about, that the stigma of abortion means that its use in legitimate medical, procedures for the health of a pregnant woman, it's called something else. It has some other kind of like codifying terminology. But when it comes down to, the legislative landscape, it very much becomes an unavailable medical technique, right? So if you have an ectopic pregnancy, it doesn't matter that you're probably going to die because the procedure to fix that is an abortion. If you had a miscarriage of some kind that has some, for example, an ectopic pregnancy would automatically lead to a miscarriage. But if there was some other type of miscarriage that was threatening the life of the mother for any reason, like internal hemorrhaging, things like that, the medical procedure to remediate that is abortion. If the health of the fetus is at risk and it's pretty much guaranteed that that fetus is not viable, it will have an impact on the health of the mother as well, inevitably, once the fetus dies. And it doesn't just like pop out, right? So the medical procedure to remediate that is abortion. So again, I think that we could do a better job communicating the actual effect that legislation like this has on the medical procedure. You can talk to the morality of the issue as much as you want. You can cultivate programs that help people understand your position on the feelings that you have about abortion, but that doesn't make it right to make it a law that also happens to subjugate women as second class citizens who do not carry the same bodily rights as men. And yet, so you're saying that even though we don't have a say over how our bodies are treated medically and whether or not we're going to die, we don't get a choice in that matter, right? Even though there's a medical procedure that could fix it. You're saying that under those conditions we have equal protection under the law, that we're equal citizens? Because if that's your argument, that's obviously wrong. And you should maybe revisit the logic of that decision, is how I feel about that, I guess. But and again, the conversation being centered on the morality of a medical procedure could really only happen where women are concerned, because no, I take it back. People of color as well. That's, but there's less of a distinction, reproductively, or medically or anatomically, between, there's no distinction between people of different, quote unquote races. But, there are those medical distinctions between men and women in the reproductive scape, right? The sex organs are distinctly different. So the medical procedures associated with them are distinctly different, and women, as if there were a, and I know this is trotting out the old liberal argument. I'm like, if they were men, it would never happen. But it's true. I mean, it's true. And it's also true that as I've discussed before in previous pods, the history of medical texts, the history of anatomy has all been done. The research has typically all been done focused on the male anatomy. As an example, the medical industry anatomically has no idea what the clitoris is or does or how it works. And yet they have probably 4 or 5 different types of medications that can treat erectile dysfunction. So that's what? That doesn't seem balanced or right or medically objective in any way, shape, or form. That's why I'm saying it's the men's in this one who are, kind of hold us back. You're holding us back on this. So that's a hill I'm kind of willing to die on. I think that women who are anti-abortion are complicated in their decision making. And again, perhaps don't find themselves in the same kind of knowledge landscape, right? It's always painted as a moral issue. So what say you're a woman who is staunchly pro-life and you have an ectopic pregnancy. And the doctor says, the only way we can fix this is through an abortion. You're going to die otherwise. What do you think the choice you're going to make is? I mean, the taking all the legal framework off the table. What are you going to be like, but abortion is wrong? It's not even a viable, fetus. It's never going to become a human person. It's just a lump of flesh inside your body that's going to kill you like a tumor. But abortion is wrong. So I recognize that this is a scenario in which I have very little, wiggle room, and that's something that I don't like to kind of put out there on the pod. Really, I like to, if I'm honest, I like to keep this sort of a more or less judgment-free zone. I like to keep my life a more or less judgment-free zone, but on this thing, I can't do it. I can't. So I hope you'll forgive that, as I will forgive anyone who has a differing opinion from me. I just hope that, you can think about it rationally and think about it, in a more specific context in terms of how it affects people's lives, how those choices, how your moral preferences affect the medical needs of a person you don't know, because it does. Also vote. Okay, and in the next bit, I am going to dive a little bit more into the Supreme Court. I want to talk about the shadow docket, and I want to talk about some of the cases that are on that shadow docket now, and why they're really kind of prescient and important. So I hope you'll come back and listen, even though I really was preachy just now. I recognize it. I'm not going to hide from it. I feel strongly about this thing, and I kind of make no apologies for it. I feel like my reasons are sound, and I feel good about it in my heart. So I don't hold ill will in my being for people who have differences of opinion. I just hope that their differences of opinion can be influenced with facts and more information that broadens the viewpoint. That's my feeling. So that's all I'm going to say on that. I promise. I'm not gonna keep like hammering on it. I'm sipping it. Zip. Thank you so much for joining me and listening. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you will come back for the next couple of bits of it because they're meaty. There's a lot I want to talk about. I've been thinking about a lot of things, and my brain is finally like coming up to a place where I have like the ability to pull them together into a cohesive thread. So, in the next part, I'm going to be again talking about the Supreme Court and the shadow docket that's up right now, which has cases on redistricting and gerrymandering, as well as surprisingly affirmative action. So, I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then sort of talk about the court, kind of more broadly. And then in the third part, I've got something that it feels a little bit non sequitur, but it's not because it sort of relates to pieces of the affirmative action piece. So, but it does talk a little bit about sort of some immigration policy and how that has sort of shaped, the understanding of um, affirmative action, frankly, and like sort of just racial considerations in how we as a country, how the US tends to like, kind of measure and weigh that. It's interesting stuff. I know it doesn't sound interesting the way I describe it, perhaps, but it totally is. Totally, totally is. So, thank you again for listening. I hope you'll join me again. If you have questions or feedback or comments, I'd love to hear them. Please reach out. You can find me. I have an email address at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI makes a podcast at gmail.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. Thank you so much. And I will see you next time. Bye.